sretna pod suncem, rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvjetaj zemljo radnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, Tita.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome along. It is the afternoon of the 21st of November at around 3:15 British time. Here we are today with another live stream talking about a number of hot issues of the moment. And the leading story amongst liberals, of course, is that Netanyahu and Gallant, the now sacked Israeli defense minister, have been indicted by that most useless of bodies, the International Criminal Court, a court which was designed really by the imperialists themselves and was designed principally to indict people who in some way, in some small way, got in the way of their schemes. So they had to make a move against Netanyahu, though, because otherwise, whatever tattered pieces of credibility that they had left would be blown out of the water, because the crimes of the regime, I'm going to call it the U.S. colonial regime in occupied Palestine, are so huge and have gone on for so long that if the ICC had refused to do anything, then what little belief is left in it by naive liberals everywhere would have gone out the window. So, in indictment of Netanyahu and Gallant, it is, of course, greeted with contempt by Netanyahu and his friends in the US, because he knows very well it will never actually come to pass that he will be arrested. He will never be put on trial anywhere. He will more than likely, after many years of loyal service to US imperialism, retire to Florida, that resting home for the terminally barbarous colonial officials like Netanyahu, Cuban exiled terrorists, Venezuelan exiled terrorists, and a roll call of probably Ukrainian compradors who will end up there after this shit show in Ukraine now comes to a close. So a PR move principally by the International Criminal Court that will lead to absolutely nothing. International law is largely a farce. It can be used periodically for propaganda purposes by our side and by theirs. By theirs, I mean the imperialists. But principally, it's a farce. It has no real meaning to it whatsoever. These are simply institutions that were created by imperialism, especially those that were created post-1991, that really are there to put a legal gloss on things that they want to do. Now, some of the people who work within these institutions are naive enough to believe that their remit means something, whereas in actual fact, of course, it doesn't. Because who is going to arrest Netanyahu? Gallant, on the other hand, has rather run out of friends. He might be a different matter. He will need to be very careful about where he goes, but no one is going to arrest Netanyahu. The only ones who could, of course, are the United States, and they're not going to do it. Of course, it will make him perhaps a little more cautious, but in truth, he could turn up anywhere in Europe tomorrow and no one would do a damn thing. Certainly not in this country. They don't arrest criminals over here. They arrest you if you point out that criminal deeds are being committed. That's the state of Britain. But the Israeli regime will, of course, get away with it because the Israeli regime is an extension of the power of US imperialism. And if you're playing that role and you're playing it reliably, then you can get away with pretty much anything. Now, it was an interesting note made in the comments by our regular viewer Svetlana, who commented that, of course, Netanyahu might know rather a lot of things, a man who knows too much. And that is certainly true. Netanyahu has been around for a long time, and he's been an active agent of US imperialism for his entire professional life. So that goes all the way back to the 1970s. He knows a hell of a lot. He's been prime minister, I think, longer cumulatively than anybody else in Israel's history. He has dealt with many US presidents and US spy chiefs, knows an awful lot about secret US operations. There is no way that the US abandons him. But to answer the comment that Daniel made in the discussion group here on the stream, what if the US finds somebody else to manage the colonial regime in occupied Palestine for them? It's an interesting thought. Would the US abandon Netanyahu? Now, of course, there are different factions within US imperialism. Some of these are indeed more in favor of Netanyahu. Some of them are more against him. Some in the Biden clique, or the Democrats, favored a more avowedly liberal occupation regime. They favored perhaps Gantz, who could speak the language of liberalism, at least in the United States, and who wasn't as openly aligned with the absolute hardcore fascist elements in Israel, such as, of course, Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, or Bezalel Smotrich, both of whom represent the open fascist elements. And Netanyahu's alliance with them is embarrassing for the bourgeois liberals in the United States. It's not that they object to the things these people do. In the end, they're all pursuing the same agenda, but the liberals do like their aesthetics, and they don't like to be openly tied to fascism. They like to maintain some plausible deniability. Netanyahu has become too crude and too open about what he's doing, which is why some elements in the US would prefer somebody else. But is there anybody else? This is the question. There's a good reason why Netanyahu has proved himself to be a real survivor when it comes to colonial politics, and that is because he has an understanding of the role that Israel plays for US imperialism. He understands US politics very well. Of course, he is, or either is or was, an American citizen, depending upon which story about his prior history you choose to believe. He knows the US and its ruling clique very, very well. So he understands the usage that the Israeli regime has for US imperialism, and he understands the players in the US system. He also understands the trajectory of Israeli society. He understands that better than anybody else. He was present, of course, in the leadership of Likud when the Israeli Social Democrats, the Labour Party, by the way, just as bad, just as ruthless as he is, collapsed in the later 1990s and early 2000s, and he directly benefited from that. And he has seen and encouraged the growth of more and more extreme elements in the form of the settler parties, which he has openly allied himself with for many years. And he has been the only one who can pull together reliable and stable coalitions based upon these fascist elements. Again, he's done this for years. The opposition to him is a collection of increasingly unpopular liberals who, again, people like Naftali Bennett or Benny Gantz or others of their ilk, like Yair Lapid, are liberals in the worst sense of the term, in that they will do all the things that Netanyahu will do. They'll just do them with a bit of an extra gloss on them. And there's no conceivable way that any of these guys would have acted really that much differently after October the 7th. Perhaps some of them would have gone for a deal, but Netanyahu hasn't gone for a deal. Netanyahu hasn't gone for a deal because his masters in Washington haven't pushed for a deal. Not really. I mean, bear in mind what we've said before about the nature of the relationship between the colonial administration in Tel Aviv and the US imperialists themselves. The US imperialists, for their strategic objectives to be met, require the destruction of the axis of resistance. And that because it's not just a resistance to the colonial state run out of Tel Aviv. It's also a resistance to the US imperialists themselves. They are trying to remove Hamas. They're trying to remove Hezbollah by destabilizing Lebanon. They're trying to destroy the Iraqi resistance, and ultimately they want to destroy the Iranian state itself. Again, these are very old aims. These aims are in complete continuity from presidential administration to presidential administration. They do not change. And so Netanyahu, in going after Hamas in a serious way, or trying to, failing, and going after Hezbollah in a serious way, and failing, trying to go after resistance in Iraq and trying to continue to attempt to destroy the government in Syria, is trying very hard to fulfill his duties as a reliable enforcer of US imperial rule. And as long as he plays that role well, he'll continue to be protected. And he is pursuing aims which the US itself wants to pursue. The US requires, as I said, the destruction of Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is the only force, or I should say, the most powerful force, fighting against US domination of Lebanon. And US domination of Lebanon is crucial for the US imperialists to realize their regional goals, which is, of course, maintaining control over what is described as West Asia, what I describe as West Asia. So as the farce that the Biden administration was engaging in, and they engaged in it all the way through the last year, that there was going to be some kind of settlement, that they were working for it constantly. This was all a lie. They never were. There was an initial flurry of negotiations, and then there was some kind of debate inside the US administration itself, and they decided to remain solidly behind the aggressive course of action. And they did so because of, again, there's a multitude of reasons, but firstly because they require the destruction of the axis of resistance, and also they were considering what would happen inside Israel if Netanyahu was forced into a settlement. It would destabilize Israel. It would destabilize Israel because the bulk of the Israeli population are on side with everything that Netanyahu has done. Like 90-odd% of them are. That's consistent in Israeli opinion polling. There is a minority, a small minority, which consistently has dissented since October the 7th last year. So if the US forced a peace settlement, which it could do, what that would do, though, is destabilize the Israeli regime. It would destabilize the government of Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, etc. would pull out of it. It would force new elections, which would deliver probably an inconclusive result, as the more liberal types like Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, Benny Gantz, are not particularly popular, not popular enough to overcome the voting bloc of Likud and the settler fascist parties. So you destabilize the Netanyahu administration. What do you replace it with? Do they have anybody that they can bring in who is as reliable a servant as he is? And the answer is no. They don't. He's the only figure in the Israeli political system who has reliably put together coalitions for the last almost 30 years. So without him, Israeli politics becomes a lot more unstable, and therefore the use value of Israel declines. And so they're stuck with him, whether they like him or not. Now, of course, he's a man who isn't getting any younger, who has health problems. So eventually he's going to be forced out, but he will stay in that prime minister's office to the bitter fucking end. And no one's going to arrest him. Let's just get that out of the way straight away. There's nobody can force him to go. Well, the only country that could ever force him to go would be the US itself, and they're not going to do that. They've forced Netanyahu into a trial run by the International Criminal Court. Netanyahu would turn against them and would grass up every dirty politician and security official that he's got dirt on, which is probably quite extensive. He's not a stupid man. He will know that the game of colonial politics can be treacherous, and he'll always have thought that at the back of his mind that they might turn on him. So he's got a lot of secrets he can divulge, things that he secured agreements for, going all the way back to George W. Bush. A lot of these people are still alive. He could disgrace many of them if they turned on him. They all know that. So as a consequence, he will never face consequences for what he has done. There's no way he will ever be arrested, unless, of course, the current ruling class in the United States is overthrown and a new rule of the working class is instituted in the USA, which, much as I would like that to happen, this is very unlikely at this stage. So the ICC indictment is most likely a PR move, by the ICC itself to make it look as if they are enforcing these things in any way fairly, and it is a PR move to retain credibility for the court system. Unlikely to lead anywhere, unlikely to do anything. Now, related to that, the whole question of the shifting sands in West Asia needs to be addressed, because, of course, the shifting sands are clear because of the defeat of the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea, the fact that they were forced to withdraw, their inability to force back Ansar Allah, what I would call the National Liberation Government of Yemen. I think that's the best description I can use for them, and their impotence against Iran. They're striking Iran, but in a way that is very unclear if they actually did anything. So this is clearly a changing situation in West Asia, and into this we must of course add the further complication for the US, that now they've bitten a particular bullet of, ineffectually as it turned out, launching some ATACMS missiles, as we discussed on last night's program, into Russia itself, not just Russian areas of Ukraine that are contested, shall we say, or which are contested in international bodies, not that are contested by the populations there who have made their choice. Well, now they've done that, the Russians have an awful lot of choice as to what they could do next. Now, we heard that they launched an intermediate range missile at an arms manufacturing plant in Dnipropetrovsk today, or earlier today. And this is an intermediate range intercontinental ballistic missile, I believe with 6 warheads in it. So it's not a nuke, but it's something which is nuclear capable, and something which could easily reach most of the major urban centres of Europe. And the funny thing is, of course, that these were restricted under the Intermediate Range Treaty, which, of course, Donald Trump scrapped and walked out of, funnily enough. So the Russians have dumped this on Dnipropetrovsk, or a factory in Dnipropetrovsk, as a sign of what they could do. This might be why the US ran out of its embassy yesterday, and why many other European nations also scuttled out of Kiev, being the useless cowards that they are. So, what I didn't emphasize last night, and what I should emphasize now, is that the Russians have a wide variety of options in terms of responding to the United States. One of those is, of course, to covertly collaborate with various different forces inside West Asia to go up against US power there. We have, of course, the example of what is going on in Syria, the continued US occupation of northern Syria, or at least a portion of northern Syria. This could be something which the Russians choose to make to aid the Syrians in evicting the US from there. That's a very big target that the Russians could choose to collaborate with forces that are targeting that. We've already mentioned Ansar Allah, and they, of course, most likely do receive assistance from Iran, but who knows what Iran is passing to them. If it could be that certain Russian systems have been passed to Ansar Allah, we don't know. They certainly wouldn't be out of the range of possibilities for them to do that. The other thing they could do, of course, is aid the Syrians in targeting Israeli aircraft. That would be a big one, though, and I doubt that they'd do that immediately, but that would be a game changer for Syria. So recently, the Israeli regime bombed a site in Palmyra, killing at least 30 people. And they're able to do this because the Russians, of course, have got air defense around their own assets in Syria, but due to the complicated way in which Russian forces are deployed and the complications in the relationship between the Russians and the U.S. colonial entity known as Israel, they haven't provided the Syrians with the ability to shoot down Israeli planes yet. Though I do wonder how long that will last, because at the moment Israel enjoys complete impunity to act and bomb anybody it likes, almost, other than, of course, in Iran itself, where the story was, of course, in the last round of strikes, that they unexpectedly received a lock-on warning from an Iranian air defense system locking onto the Israeli planes, and that's what caused the whole thing to be aborted. They had to scuttle out of there in a humiliating fashion. So if the Syrians were to gain such a power, then that would be another blow to Israel. Thinking on from there, if Hezbollah gained such a power, then that would be a huge real terms and psychological defeat for Israel, in that they would no longer be able to fly their aircraft with impunity. And so these are all options that are on the table for the Russians in terms of making life difficult for the US. Which ones they will choose, we do not know. I suspect it will be further retaliation will be the subject of a rather long debate within Russian political and military and intelligence circles, but certainly a response will come. And certainly it will, I think, almost certainly have a aspect of it focused on West Asia. The Russian role in terms of its alliance with Iran has grown and grown. The ability of the US to target Iran has declined and declined over the years. They, of course, would have loved to have used the Saddam Hussein regime to go after Iran in the 80s, and indeed they tried to do that, whilst, of course, doing deals with the Iranians behind the scenes. But really they wanted the Iranian regime crushed, failed to do that, can't do it now either. And, of course, this weakens US imperialism considerably in terms of its image. If it can't defend its colony in Israel, if it can't intimidate the Iranians, if it can't realistically project its force anymore, then all of these things speed up the crisis within the US imperialist system itself. So let's now pause and take some questions. We have 227 of you watching, mostly on X and on YouTube. We're also live on Instagram and on Twitch. I tried to get the Facebook account going on with it, but it's playing up thus far. So like and share all of these options if you haven't done so already. So, moving on. Official hellos to Svetlana in Moscow, Victor, Grasinol in Seattle, Washington, Davey on an icy building site in Gwynedd, Almir in the once-and future Slovenia, Yugoslavia, Dinner with Franklin, hello to you. Daniel, hello to you out there in Bristol. Hello to Enigma, and also hello to Medic484, coming to us from Holyoke, Massachusetts. Hello to Jerry, and hello to Bok Precision. And we've also got a comment here from our friend out there in Canada, I believe, who says, there is no real left in Israel, it's fascists versus ultra-fascist, which is broadly correct. There are some isolated parts of the population that are opposed to it, but the great bulk of the population's all in on the genocidal practices of Netanyahu. Hello to Marxist Infiltrator on Rumble, coming to us from Norfolk, Virginia. Hello to Holistic Politics. Grassy Knoll says, John Bolton threatened the International Court back in the Bush administration, and that's correct. Bolton did do that. just the kind of crude threat that he would make, really. Didn't even realize that the International Criminal Court principally works for them. But perhaps he did, and he objected to them trying to keep even a semblance of neutrality. Will Johnson, hello to you out there in a frosty Holmfirth, West Yorkshire. More time needed, hello to you out there in Skegness. Mutanda says, finished work early because of the snow. Soft southerners that we are. There's snow in the south, is there? There's like a tiny amount of slush up here. Hello to T.G. Wilson. Hello to Tim Gray, who says it was brass monkeys cycling to the shops today. Indeed, indeed. Hello to Jonathan Collins, who joins us from just about snow-topped West Lancashire. T.G. Wilson says, arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant and resistance heroes. Performative bullshit that presents a false moral equivalence between legal resistance and psychopathic genociders. Good point, well made. Right, who else we got? We got Jace Hart joining us from Wisconsin, where it is, or it was when this comment was made, 9 a.m. So good morning to listeners in Wisconsin, whether in Milwaukee or elsewhere. And what's the other big town in Wisconsin? Is it Madison? Madison, Wisconsin? VV says Russia used a conventional MIRV today. What do you think? Oh, I've just talked a little bit about that. It's a warning, principally. I mean, they didn't need to use a intermediate range ballistic missile to target this factory in Dnipropetrovsk. But again, the point is being made to the Europeans, to the Germans, to the French, and to the British, that we have this and can use it on you. Like if you insist on still being stupid. I think what will happen is Ukraine will burn through its ATACMS stock, its Storm Shadow stock, its Scalp stock, and that will be it. There won't be any more provided because there's already a crisis of provision in the British military anyway, of the Storm Shadows. The Americans apparently don't produce that many ATACMS missiles per year. And the French don't produce many of the Scalp missiles either. I mean, it may be that they get that weakling Schultz to agree to have Ukraine use the Taurus missiles, but again, there's not that many of them either. And they're pretty similar, apparently, to the Scalps and the Storm Shadows, which the Russians have already mastered the electronic warfare game against. So what are they going to do with them? These are all things which are going to fail. And again, it doesn't change the fact that the Russians are winning the war. They are winning the war and winning it hands down. So they can take their time in choosing their response. They don't need to rush things. They don't need to make rash decisions. They can make their point forcefully and continue to push the US in other areas. I mean, look at what is happening in West Africa, for instance, where the French have had their influence severely damaged and will likely be erased entirely within the next few years. I mean, the nationalist governments in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso are going to be joined by others pretty soon. I mean, there's a left reformist government in Senegal which seems quite strong. They're making moves of a similar nature to remove the neo-colonial influence of the French. Like the CFA franc zone is going to bite the dust pretty soon. That's going to go. And without the ability to extract wealth from the neo-colonies in West Africa, French imperialism is going to be absolutely fucked. And they will have no choice but either to try and engage in colonial aggression or to try and branch out and try and either re-establish themselves in Africa or try some sort of colonial aggression elsewhere. But they haven't got the strength to do it anymore. They really don't. So they will turn in on themselves and turn on the French working class, which will intensify the class war at home. This is the way it's going. So we are left in a situation where the influence of the Europeans, particularly in Africa, in the African nations, is going to go down, where the comprador regimes that the Europeans have relied on to maintain their influence are all going to come under threat very soon. The Ruto government in Kenya has been under a lot of pressure for many months now, including from the Communist Party of Kenya, which had its, I think, a congress quite recently, who have been engaged in heroic struggles against the Ruto regime, which is a regime tied to American and British imperialism. Now, if the Kenyan regime was to go down, that would be a huge blow to British imperialism, given that they have kept a lot of interests there ever since Kenya was granted nominal independence all the way back in the early 1960s. But that influence is coming under pressure now. And as the Europeans feel the pressure of the masses in the African nations turning on them, well, these new nationalist governments or left nationalist governments will turn to China and Russia for assistance. And hence, the Russians have a lot of choices as to how they ruin Emmanuel Macron's day. You want to fire scalp missiles into Russia? Well, we don't need to bomb Paris. We can just drop a financial bomb on you by aiding the liberation movements in West Africa. There'll be more to come. I mean, you've had Free pretty strongly established themselves now. They've, of course, got problems. They have Western proxies in the form of Al-Qaeda forces to defeat, but the Russians are assisting with that. There's also, the French are losing ground in Senegal. You've also got the Ivory Coast, which has been a pretty reliable neo-colony of the French for many years. If that were to go, that would inflict further damage. Guinea as well has been contested territory for a while now. So all of these countries are making moves not just towards independence, but towards active collaboration, realizing that the borders that were drawn at the end of the period of direct French military occupation and British military occupation for some of these areas in West Africa were in many respects false, and that coming together in a wider confederation of states will increase their economic and military potential and increase their security, stop them also being divided and played off against each other by imperialism. See, what the imperialists don't realize is that many people in these nations, many of whom are now in positions of responsibility, have studied the history of the failures of the liberation movements back in the 20th century and have realized the problems that occurred with them and are now looking to learn from those problems and to actually get to the point where they can move forward with their long-standing struggle for genuine independence. So again, if the Russians really want to stick it to the Europeans, they just need to assist there. Again, that's a bomb that will go off as reliably as any intermediate-range ballistic missile, and in reality, do much more damage. Bomb damage can be repaired. Losing access to markets, losing access to cheap resources or easily exploitable resources like uranium, like gold, and other precious metals that come from West Africa. Well, you can't replace that as easily. And you can't replace the wealth that's been extracted from those countries easily. For instance, like huge amount of France's gold reserves have been all pilfered from Mali. You lose access to that is incredibly damaging. So the liberation process that is ongoing is going to doom a lot of the Western European nations. And again, like the Russians can simply assist with that. They don't need to play a direct role. They can play an indirect role. But just by giving the West African nations options outside of the US and European dominated financial systems, then you assist in the liberation process, often in a subtle way. It's like the Chinese. The Chinese provide assistance in this liberation process simply by being willing to do deals with anybody, and of course doing business in a way that's far more mutually beneficial than anything the US would ever provide. And they don't need to do anything spectacular politically or make bold declarations. They just slowly push out US influence by offering better terms than the imperialists ever could or would. So there you go. The imperialists are sunk. The Russian leadership knows that they are sunk. It's just a question of picking where you have your retaliation against them, and doing so in such a way that causes maximum discomfort for the imperialists at minimal cost to the Russians. Right. Let's go a little bit further through the comments here. Hello to Nikki Const, who joined us, and to Christopher Rogers from Hong Kong. S.W. Haster says, after this indictment, providing weapons will become tricky. No? No, it won't, because no matter whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, weapons will still be provided, because we're talking about the strategic position of US imperialism in West Asia here. They're not going to let the ICC and its indictment, its petty indictments, get in the way of that. And this is one of the reasons why the Trump administration is advantageous for US imperialism, because they won't even pretend to care about it. They'll just supply them no matter what. Whereas Biden's group would twist and turn and lie and bullshit, Trump will just do it, saying, we're going to give Bibi all the bombs he could ever want. He can even invade his homeland, Poland, if he wants to. No, it won't put a barrier to it. It will provide it provides some useful propaganda for our side in terms of pointing out things. So, like if in our situation here in Britain, it'd be useful for pointing out when trying to tackle the Labour Party government here and its collaborators, that they're providing arms to a man who's been indicted for war crimes. Won't make any difference. The British government will still do it, whether it's Labour or Tory. But again, it's potentially useful for showing people of a liberal disposition just how much of a joke the international institutions are. But no, it's no significant barrier for them. David King says, if the garrison falls, West Asia falls, and that is correct. Hello to Sid, who joins us on a cold and snowy day in the American Midwest. Hello to you out there in the American Midwest. Almir says, it's obvious that Israeli society is the sickest in the world. Well, there's a fair bit of competition in the West for that title. 90% of them have gone mental. It's embarrassing for their Western masters. Embarrassing, but they can get over embarrassment. Embarrassment is, it's something they would prefer not to have to try and excuse, people celebrating a genocide. But fundamentally, we're talking here about, again, to reiterate the point, the strategic position of US imperialism in West Asia. If that's compromised by Israel being defeated, then that's pretty much, if not the end, then we are on a path to the end. We're on it already, but it'll push US imperialism further towards its end. And they absolutely cannot have that. They will face up to, and they will embrace any amount of genocide and repression that they need to in order to preserve that position in West Asia. And at the moment, they're not giving up. And they're not giving up the Israeli regime. Because again, if they do that, then they are defeated. There will be some who will argue that, well, why doesn't, and you get these opinions in certain establishment circles in Britain. People like Alan Duncan, the former Foreign Office Minister, will argue things like this. They will argue that why doesn't the West, the British, or particularly the US, why doesn't the US just abandon Israel? Because it's doing more damage to US interests than it is good. That's like the John Mearsheimer point of view, the realist point of view, that it's ultimately much more damaging for the US to stick with the Israeli regime than it is to force a settlement. And the this point of view, I've explained before that I think this is a wrong-headed point of view, because it misunderstands what the nature of the U.S. power is. U.S. is an imperialist power. U.S. does not want partnerships with Lebanon or Syria, or even like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. They don't want partnerships. They don't desire partnerships. They desire total domination. That's what they desire. It's what imperialism needs. It doesn't need partners. It needs supplicants, stooges, compradors. That's what it needs. So it needs regimes that are prepared to basically surrender all sovereignty and independence whenever the US demands it. That's what imperialism requires. To get that doesn't require you to be diplomatic. It requires you to maintain your stranglehold over the region. And you maintain that by now by force. And Israel, the colonial regime run out of Tel Aviv, is a crucial component to maintaining dominance in West Asia by force. And so the point of view of like the so-called realists is, ironically enough, unrealistic, because they don't understand the nature of imperialism. Yes, the dog was going nuts when I mentioned Netanyahu's name. Surely a coincidence. Apparently YouTube is censoring some comments. Can't say I'm surprised. Hello to Miguel Carvalho, who joins us from Portugal. Greetings to you. And to Yuan, who comes here from Phoenix, Arizona. Just going through some comments here. Be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. So, just going through here. Almir says, I hear Hezbollah is using Russian Kornet missile systems, very effective anti-tank weapons, a good way for the Russian government to retaliate. Effective AA weapon would be a game changer, though. That's true. I've said this before, and we were discussing it in relation to Syria. If the Israeli Air Force, which is really was the only reliable force they've got, because the Hezbollah can not only match but beat the Israelis infantry to infantry. Even Israeli military officers, retired officers, admit that. They're better trained, more disciplined, better equipped in some cases, and are much better fighters than the Israelis are. They can neutralize Israeli armor with, as Almir's comment suggests, using the Russian-made Kornet missile systems. So if they get effective anti-aircraft weapons, that is it. It's all over. Because if Israel can't freely carpet bomb its targets, then really they've got nothing left. So if Israel starts losing planes, that will be a massive crisis for Netanyahu. A crisis he may not be able to get over. That would be shattering in terms of the confidence of that regime. And it would also, if they started losing quite a few planes, that would also test the ability of the US to resupply them. Again, so the question is not if they get hold of anti-aircraft weapons, it's when. Because it will happen, because the demand is there. So somebody will find a way to supply them. Iran must have these. I wonder if Hezbollah has them already, but is waiting for the right moment to use them. It would be, of course, they're not sharing that information with anybody, but it would be interesting to see when these things do turn up, because I imagine that they will quite soon. Good evening to Why Ain't It Cool 46 over there on Twitch. Just on the question of Twitch and uploading videos to it, I had a look into this, and the question is that of like uploading videos, uploading the live stream video recording to Twitch after we're done with it here. You can only do that if you reach a certain stage of a Twitch account. So like if you've got a certain audience, if you've streamed a number of times to it, then they'll invite you to apply for like the next level where you can upload videos to it. So if more people watch on Twitch, then and I stream more to it, then the videos will get uploaded there. Daniel asks, would you recommend reading Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism by Kwame Nkrumah? I would recommend reading that. It's a fascinating work by a man who was right in the middle of the liberation struggles of his homeland in Ghana, who was ultimately cooed out by British imperialism. I believe he spent his final few years in socialist Romania. I think he died there. But yes, very interesting guy, Kwame Nkrumah, a heroic revolutionary. And yes, his book on neocolonialism is very much worth reading, absolutely current in terms of its relevance. Hello to Alan Effort, who joins us from Dundee, Scotland. Rules Rejoice says, the world has changed whether we like it or not. Things are moving fast. It's an accurate observation. Agricola asked, is there any confirmation for the intercontinental missile strike other than Ukraine and the Western sewer? I believe Maria Zakharova said in her press conference that she couldn't possibly comment on it, which means, yes, they did do it. And again, like, it's a warning of what they can do. Hello to James Wright, who joins us from the northwestern part of perfidious Albion. Is that northwest England or northwest Scotland? Do let me know. Hello to Judith, who says Ben Gvir said that the answer to the arrest warrants is to take over the West Bank. Well, that is their answer. I mean, Netanyahu's been talking about that for a long time. The reason why they haven't done it is not because they don't want to. It's because or that the Americans would restrain them. I don't think they would. It's that they are unsure as to what would happen. Now, at the moment, they've still got Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. For all the unity agreements that the Chinese have ever seen, Abbas is still working for the US, really, when it comes down to it. He's still arresting resistance figures. The Palestinian Authority police still act in conjunction with the Israelis. So taking over the West Bank, basically dissolving the Palestinian Authority, that's a big risk. Netanyahu, again, I think this observation was made on, I think it might have been on an electronic intifada stream, I'm not sure, but one of the guests that they have on there made a very accurate observation, which is that Netanyahu likes to act like a wild man, but he only acts like that when he's absolutely certain that he's acting with the full backing of the US. So this talk of taking over the West Bank, yeah, many of them would do it tomorrow if they thought they could get away with it. I think Netanyahu is hesitating, though, because he is worried about the consequences. He's worried about the consequences of essentially dissolving the PA, removing or ending the alliance with Abbas. And if you remove that, basically you leave your collaborators in the form of the Palestinian capitalist class, which do exist and who have a lot of compradors amongst them, who are more than happy to do business with the Israeli regime and US imperialism. You leave your collaborators with nowhere to go. You cut their knees off. Because now it's just a case of the Israeli regime has directly occupied the West Bank. It's dismissed the PA, and the future for the Palestinians there will either be one of expulsion or to essentially live in a dystopian apartheid system, which is already there to a large degree. It's partly enforced by the PA. So what happens then is that essentially, I think what Netanyahu would be worried about is that that'll only intensify the resistance against him, because now you have a whole load of Palestinian security forces who have been essentially working for Israel, who are now out of a job. Now, I think what Netanyahu would be trying to work out is a way in which they take over the West Bank, but still keep the comprador element of the Palestinian capitalists on side, and try and keep that alliance with the PA going in some form or another, because it relieves him of security responsibilities within certain areas. Whereas if you just tried to digest all of the West Bank at once, dismiss the PA, take the nuclear option that the likes of Ben-Gvir would favour, that might prove too hot to handle. And they already have a lot of problems trying to do raids in refugee camps on the West Bank. So suddenly you're going to take over all of it and leave your previous collaborators basically twisting in the wind, get a whole new bunch of armed men who used to be partially paid by the US to enforce colonial rule. Suddenly they turn on you, and you're left with a much more unified and angry population. Whereas at the moment, they're still playing on the divisions that do exist within Palestinian society. You're still able to collaborate with certain compradors represented by Abbas's regime. You remove all of that all at once, you're faced with an awful lot of problems that you may not be able to resolve. So, we are our friend and frequent collaborator Kit Clarenberg is arriving in just a moment, so going to be having him on. So I'm going to place the ceremonial headphones on. Jacob the Squirrel asks, why has Musk purchased himself his own US president? Does he want to monopolize social media, or is it about Tesla or something else? Well, I think it would be a mistake to see Trump as being owned by Musk. Musk likes a winning team. He's been associated with both halves of the political divide in the United States, and so he likes to back a winner. Trump looked like he was going to be the winner. Musk backed him. Musk gets given a non-job, this Doge department, which won't really come up with much that is exactly new. It'll just be the same boilerplate Republican policies, but sold as libertarianism now. Really, I think what he was doing most of all is protecting certain business interests. Bear in mind, he makes a lot of money off Pentagon contracts. He won't be cutting any of that anytime soon. So yeah, this is a defense of business interests more than it is anything else for Musk. Alan says, my wife described the weather as freezing the Frupneys off her, so not warm in Scotland's east today. Not warm anywhere in perfidious Albion today. The Lemon asks, has Russia extended itself by taking too much Ukrainian speaking territory? Probably not, I would say. Probably not, because, again, like the Russians, I should say the Russians as currently constituted by the Putin-led administrations don't have an interest in eliminating the Ukrainian language or Ukrainian culture. They just don't. They haven't done that in any of the areas that they have absorbed into Russia so far. The Banderists do not represent even the majority of Western Ukrainians, and never did. They represent no more than 10 to 20% of the population tops, and a lot of their militants are dead now. So, but also bear in mind that for the bulk of Ukraine, what will be done, I think, my own interpretation here, is that another version of a Ukrainian state will be reconstituted. The Russians will probably stick with absorption of maybe a bit more. They'll get the rest of Zaporozhye and Kherson region. They'll get the entirety of Donetsk, the Donetsk People's Republic, liberated. As for the rest of it, they'll push the Ukrainian regime to the point of collapse. They might have to temporarily occupy large areas of what was once Ukraine, Ukraine. But I think that they would prefer, I think, to reconstitute another version of a Ukrainian state rather than engage in direct rule. Now, that will be difficult. There'll be all kinds of barriers in their way. But I think that the reconstituting a Ukrainian state and then having it bound into agreements on security with the with the Russian Federation, this is what they're going to do. That's the likely future. So they won't be actually, I don't think, occupying much more the majority Ukrainian speaking territory. I don't. That's my interpretation. Just Another Parasite says, South Korean birth rates are getting so low in a terminal stage of capitalism that the North Koreans won't even have to invade. Yeah, the nation will just die out. Or they'll try and encourage migration into South Korea. That might be one of the ways they try to solve this problem. But that'll create some problems of its own. So it'd be interesting to see how the US imperialists try and navigate their puppets out of that one. Judith Osterman says, Scott Ritter said Russia has to agree to negotiate. Well, why would they? I mean, I haven't seen that comment, but like, the negotiate about what? Like the US imperialists are the ones that have no interest in negotiations. Like, Trump's not going to negotiate either because he won't have the capacity to do it. In the end, there will be a tacit agreement, or an unspoken agreement, I should say, between the US and the Russians, but a formal agreement to end hostilities? No, I don't think you're ever going to get that. You're going to get basically a joint covert recognition of the status quo when the Russians have finished their military operation. The only plan the US and the British and the French have is just to spin out the war. Certainly that's true of the US and the British. The French situation, I will admit, I am less sure of. I'm just scrolling through some comments and writing some replies here. So, am I going to do a program on Sudan or Africa? Well, Sudan's an interesting one. The DRC. I have some books that I need to go back to on the DRC and the war there. That's like at it's in the middle of a very long reading list. So I would like to, when I get the time, is my answer to Almir's question there. TL Orca says, just say no to CIA feminism. Yes, that's true. Potted Rodent says, Russia huddles all the cards for negotiations now. That is largely correct. Not a Pacifist says, I only hope Russia refuses to compromise when it accepts the West's surrender. I hate to burst any bubbles here, but there's not going to be official surrenders or anything like that. Okay, so our friend and co-host is here with us now, so going to bring Kit onto the stage.
Alex, hey!
Hello to Kit Clarenberg. How are you doing?
Very, very, very well. I can only apologise for my tardiness. It is due to my indefatigable determination to unearth every example of imperial decline and fall I can for the show. I am, in all seriousness, and I owe not only your good self, Alex, but also our beloved viewers an apology. Yes, no, I didn't make it last week. It was a case of the dog ate my homework. I have recently uprooted myself geographically. It's been a logistical and physical hassle. But that's all over now. And so, yeah, I shan't be missing any more broadcasts. This is going to be weekly. And I'm looking forward to it. But yes, I think, yeah, I mean, it's been a pretty crazy 48 hours, is it not, Alex?
Well, if I believed what I read in either in the bourgeois press or should we say various multipolar grifter channels, I'd be dead already.
Yes.
Because Putin has promised to launch the entirety of the Russian stockpile of nuclear weapons just at Britain, and I expected to wake up in a nuclear wasteland. Quite disappointed that it was not as dramatic as that, to be honest. But yes,
still in the north of England. You're still
well,
stuck there.
yeah, well, you know what? It's better than the south, mate.
Yeah, no, indeed.
If we go off proximity to paedophile central, shall we say, known as Westminster. But yes, you are, of course, referring to the apparent decision by certain elements within the White House or within the US state machine. I won't say Biden because he probably doesn't know where he is anymore.
No.
To give the Zelensky puppet regime the permission to launch ATACMS missiles into pre-2022 Russia. And this has apparently happened, but with, shall we say, less than clear consequences so far. Though I was discussing with the audience just before you came on the apparent strike on Dnipropetrovsk by an intermediate range ballistic missile, which Maria Zakharova was, shall we say, doing some trolling about. So basically, yeah, we did it, but we're not going to say we did it. It seems to be a non too subtle message to the clowns in Europe that, yeah, we have these things. Yes, we can basically reach you in Berlin, Paris, or London. So you might want to think about what you do next, kind of thing.
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, I think that there is like an enormous number of caveats attached to this from the word go. Before Ukraine did strike, it appears, a mayonnaise factory, amongst other non-specific and non-sensitive targets. And I think that number one, I mean, yes, this is a pretty naked attempt by Biden, and I use that as shorthand for the CIA, to embroil Trump further in the war, because prior to this, there was a very clear shift, even if rhetorically, from Western officials and indeed Ukrainian officials towards a ceasefire, towards a negotiated settlement, towards territorial concessions, which is pretty huge. And there was, of course, this recent Gallup poll that showed even in the kind of hardcore neo-Nazi west of the country that there's not a majority of people who support keeping this going, which is a pretty remarkable finding. And of course, that those numbers, support for negotiated settlements get higher and higher the further east and south you get. But anyway, the point is that I mean, and I think that this is a point that Putin himself made when not long after this. And that not long after the Biden administration greenlit these strikes, which is, well, Ukraine has been striking deep inside Russia already using drones, and indeed using assassins, whether hired guns or people directly on the SBU, CIA, MI6 payroll. They have used up an enormous number of the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles that have been provided to them. I think, as we have discussed before, and it's something that I've written about for my website, Global Delinquents, shameless plug, there is a lot of recent indications that the US is running perilously low on ammunition and cannot replenish it of key missiles, of artillery shells. And it's also been reported by the Times that one of the reasons that Labour hasn't given more Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine is they are running perilously low themselves.
Yes.
And so,
we have the quote here, actually.
Go ahead.
I prepared slides and everything. It's from the Times article, as you indicated. This is a recent article from the Times of London. If you're not familiar with it, if you're watching from overseas, it's pretty much the establishment Bible in Britain, has been for over 200 years.
Yes.
So if they say something, it's most likely come from a very well-connected insider who operates within Whitehall. So defence sources, say the Times report, have suggested that Labour's reluctance to do so, that is, supply more Storm Shadows, is likely to stem from the fact that UK stockpiles have reached a level below which military chiefs are not prepared to go, because a certain number must be kept in reserve to protect the UK's own interest. That's the paedophile islands that are also tax havens. That's
Yes.
the main interest.
Most important.
Most important, yeah. It's where the blackmail material and the money is kept. Others believe that the MOD is concerned that handing Ukraine further Storm Shadow supplies now, before a decision has been reached on permission for their use in Russia, could mean they are not used as effectively as they could be in a few months' time. Well, that concern seems to have been blown out of the water by what can only be described as sort of what seems to be sort of impotent flailing so far. As you indicated, Kit, they've been firing these things at Crimea for months. Like the Russians captured at least one Storm Shadow missile intact due to the fact that they downed it via electronic warfare means. And so they've stripped this thing apart, probably reverse engineered it. They know exactly how to bring it down. So as Putin sort of indicated in his comments, like, well, what's new, really?
Yes. Indeed, and I think and I think that, I mean, on the subject of yes, Storm Shadow missiles having been used extensively against targets in Crimea, etc. I mean, they are already running. I mean, the Western powers are running low on all of these Wunderwaffe themselves. But I mean, Ukraine has expended an enormous amount of this stuff on achieving not very much. Now, there was a piece in Forbes by David Axe, who's like their resident Ukraine ultra, and he, not long after this announcement, very, very firmly stated, "Well, don't start celebrating yet, because I mean, Kiev has only probably got around 50 attackams left, and they're not going to be getting any more." So I mean, already they are tempering expectations around how they will be used and the impact they will have on the battleground, which is to say virtually nothing. But I mean, there was a very interesting Politico article I think earlier this year, where a Ukrainian military official stated that, we call this the war of one chance. So we get given Scalp, which are French missiles, or Storm Shadow missiles, and we use them for a couple of weeks effectively. And then the Russians find a way of countering it, because they're always studying. So whether that's, as you say, using electronic warfare to render HIMARS basically ineffective, that's been acknowledged, or they learn what an attack, the missiles kind of attack distances are, and they shuffle things around and whatnot, so in order to prevent Ukraine striking sensitive things. And they also, in the spirit of Russian military deception, they use dummies, they conceal things, etc. So yeah, I mean, I was very quick out the gate saying, don't, because there was a rather hysterical chorus of people, including people I think who should have known better, stating that, well, this is the start of World War III. I think actually it is a last flailing attempt to keep a proxy war that is long lost, and there is mass public and political support in the US for ending immediately and trying to keep it going. I think it's been widely perceived in this way. I think people are unhappy about that. As far as I can tell, there's been a lot of pushback against it. And yes, the Russians have made abundantly clear, well, if you really want escalation and you really want trouble, you can have it, and it's a lot worse than you can inflict on us.
Well, even here, where you will be aware, of course, that there has been a rigorous enforcement of a strict free line whip over the Ukraine war, much more than there has been over the war in occupied Palestine. Even though there is now much more police repression associated with that, due to you've seen people like Asa Winstanley been targeted. But I think the reason for that is because the war in occupied Palestine is a much more hot topic. It's been much more divisive. There's many more divisions, even in the hierarchy of the British state itself, over what they should be doing about it. The Ukraine war has been uniform in agreement from every scumbag on the right to every scumbag on the left in Britain that, oh, them damn Ruskies have to be tackled. There's been recently, though, with Starmer getting behind the decision to give the permission to launch these Storm Shadows into Russia, suddenly opposition broke out into the open just over the last couple of days. So Jeremy Corbyn woke up on the back benches and actually put a meaningful question to Starmer saying, are we at war with the Russian Federation or not? The Prime Minister should clarify it. I imagine Starmer's response will be something along the lines of his usual tight-throated waffling that doesn't answer the question, but the question's been asked. Even on outlets which are sort of ludicrous reactionary outlets like GB News, you get people asking some questions about this in a way you wouldn't have done a year ago, never mind 2 years ago. So by doing this, funnily enough, and against his intentions, Starmer has now made this war as controversial as the Israel war, basically, because now suddenly it's been revealed that the support for this amongst even reactionary sections of the population, of which there are plenty here, is pretty shallow. It's not like everything was fine as long as it was over there, very distant, and them damn Russians were never going to strike back. Suddenly, these people have realized that, oh shit, the emperor's naked.
Yes.
There's no chance we could stand up to this. Britain could be swept away by the one carefully chosen Russian like a nuclear powered torpedo, basically. So suddenly everybody's woken up and not feeling too happy about it. So Starmer, in his classic way, has delivered a great boost to anti-war sentiment.
Yes, indeed, and I think as well that it's funny because we have seen almost this exact playbook occur repeatedly, actually, and I mean it's a testament to the pace at which events are moving that this is all rather forgotten. So, in October 2023. The Daily Telegraph, which, much like the Times, is a conduit for the security intelligence services and the military, they published an exclusive about how Grant Shapps, who was then the defense secretary, was going to formally deploy British soldiers to Ukraine, and they were going to train the Ukrainians on the ground, and the British Navy could even move into the Black Sea. Now, very, very promptly, the dependably hilarious Medvedev took to Telegram and stated, well, you are openly making yourself a belligerent in this war, and therefore your military within and without Ukraine are legitimate targets for us. And then within about an hour, the Daily Telegraph radically updated its story to remove any suggestion of direct involvement by the UK in the Ukrainian war. This is not the first time and wasn't the last time that this happened. And there was a similar, again, in the Telegraph was at the center of this. There was a push I think it was the start of this year, to try and normalize the idea of conscription in the UK. And as we discussed on the first episode, Decline and Fall, what was really interesting was, the Telegraph started running a series of kind of counterfactual op-eds on what would it be like if we were at war with Russia. And Boris Johnson was making videos talking about how, maybe we need to start thinking about conscription. And the bin bag full of yogurt had the temerity to suggest that the British were fat and lazy and could do with a healthy dose of conscription in order to bring order and meaning.
After you, Boris.
Physical fitness to their lives. And very, very, very quickly, there was a huge pushback from the Telegraph's jingoistic readership, with people inundating the newspaper saying, no, stop it, drop this now. This is completely insane. It's not going to happen. So again, I think absolutely on paper, allowing Ukraine or giving the Ukraine the green light to strike deep within Russia is a major escalation, but it's that classic rhetoric versus reality divorce that we've seen so often since the start of this conflict. That there will be very, very, very grave consequences if Ukraine starts striking Russian cities. And it's important to bear in mind that they probably, due to excellent Russian air defense, but also due to the lack of missiles left in their arsenal, so to speak, that actually this probably won't amount to very much. And I think, as you say, because of the public and political pushback against this, I mean, I'm seeing this more playing in the favor of Trump ending it. And rescinding this as a, well, I mean, this is just a testament to demented Joe Biden and his underlings bitterly trying to keep this going on the way out when they know I'm going to end it. And I think, I mean, as we can get into as well, you know, this bold, grand announcement, which I mean, Starmer has been relentlessly pushing all year for this green light from the US for Ukraine to start striking deep inside Russia. There's been quite a lot of reporting in the background on British defence-related matters, which show that Britain is perhaps even an even more parlous state militarily than we thought. But this announcement may specifically serve as some kind of cover for, you know, burying bad news on other fronts, and it allows Britain to continue puffing its chest out at a time when it is just increasingly clear that it can't even maintain its already outproduced, outmanned, and basically crumbling and ineffectual military.
Well, let's get into that, because this
Yes.
links directly to something that you've written about quite recently. So I'm just going to throw up that slide here. This is on the Grey Zone site. You can go and go and read this. Now, this I wanted to get into a little bit of detail here, because you indicated in your previous statement there that the way in which the British military has disguised essentially what is a very long-term decline has been by doing things like this, which is basically what you're writing about in this article and which you've written about before extensively, about like undercover operations, terrorist actions, Gladio-style events. This is where the speciality of like the British forces actually lie. It doesn't lie anywhere else anymore. It doesn't lie. No. It's not in the naval force, as we'll come to. It's not in the air force anymore. Not really. It's not in actually fighting in terms of deploying troops anymore, because they don't even have the transport ships necessary to take the troops anywhere. They're reliant on the Americans to do it. So what seems to be being done here is, on the one hand, the Starmer announces, or Rachel Reeves is, you know, mannequin that runs the Treasury Department here.
Jabba's little mate. That's what I like to call her. Jabba's little mate. You know.
Yeah. Lied on her CV, by the way, about working for the Bank of England, which is just sad, you know. Yeah. But she announced in the recent budget $3 billion in perpetuity a year to Ukraine to keep this war going. Combined with what you're writing about here, which is the training of Ukrainians to basically do dirty undercover work in what will undoubtedly be either Russian-occupied or Russian-controlled areas of what was once this version of Ukraine. And it seems to me that what the British are doing is trying to cover up the fact that naval-wise, they're falling to pieces. They got defeated by the Yemenis in the Red Sea quite easily, as it turned out. Aircraft-wise, can't do a lot anymore. Armed force-wise, in terms of infantry, can't do a lot anymore. But they are sitting on, via the City of London, a lot of capital that they've looted from elsewhere in the world, which they can still deploy to make trouble, but only by paying and outsourcing the fighting, by paying other people to do it for them. And this seems to be where they want to take the Ukraine war, which is why that $3 billion is such an important number, because it seems to me they intend to strip their own military budget to enable them to provide this, and it's a giant outsourcing operation, effectively. What are your thoughts on that? And also, if you can talk about like the things you uncover in this sort of Gladio plan they've got here.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think number one, Alex Craner, he goes by the nickname The Naked Hedgie, has done some fantastic work mapping the extent to which Britain is in serious financial trouble because all of the loans they have given Ukraine to wage this war. Yes, they're heavily exposed there, which is one of the reasons they want to keep this going. And it is threatening a financial crisis, actually. But yeah, I think that, I mean, yeah, as you say, Alex, Britain is militarily basically a joke at this stage. But one thing they do know how to do is train people in techniques that they think are effective and that they have stuck to for many decades. And one of them is, as we have discussed, Operation Gladio. Now, Operation Gladio, just for context, was a Cold War era NATO MI6 CIA operation in which the British and the Americans trained, funded, armed, and maintained a secret network of fascist terror armies across Europe to carry out assassinations, bank robberies, like mass casualty attacks, such as like the Bologna train bombing in 1980. And the purpose was simple. It was to create, it was what was called a strategy of tension, where the public is afraid, they turn to the state for greater security, and they are willing to, trade their liberty for the freedom of being able to go about their business unmolested. And it, of course, very conveniently justifies the existence of NATO and the concomitant foreign military bases on their soil across Europe. Now, this was inspired by what was known as the Special Operations Executive, which was a similar British-run kind of sabotage, assassination, terror force in occupied Europe during World War II. Because of the perceived success of this model, Britain has ever since sought to export it and keep it running in one form or another. And Gladio is an example of this. I have reported in the past, and I've recently reported as well, that trying to create a Gladio-style terror army in Ukraine was a key British objective. They were willing to throw an enormous amount of money at this for people to, carry out strikes in Russia, in occupied parts of Ukraine, and elsewhere. And yeah, I mean, I think that you mentioned on the last show that a Georgian official stated that they'd effectively been offered the same thing when they were pressured. The Georgian Dream government in Tbilisi was pressured by an unstated foreign power to open another front. And when they said, well, we'll be crushed, they said, well, you could just fight a guerrilla war, just because reasons. And I think, this is all that Britain has got left, is this assumed and claimed expertise in fighting shadow insurgencies, which, I mean, the details of the planned Gladio operation in Ukraine, which I recently revealed, they are suitably delusional and deranged, and it included creating thousands and thousands of secret partisan fighters, and who would be trained by MI6 and SOE veterans and that sort of thing. And it sounds very, very, very impressive, and but at the same time, it's like going out flailing, actually. And we must ask ourselves, Britain is on the one hand very, very, very keen to make its involvement in the Ukraine war avert, and for other countries to do the same. But at the same time, they can't and won't commit their own forces to Ukraine because they'll get massacred. So it's good.
This is another point which again is frequently discussed here, which is that the dog evidently disapproves and he's barking her head off. But the problem for the British face is partly a problem of domestic morale. That's an issue. They don't have to go back to the old Mao Zedong point, imperialism is a paper tiger because its links with its own masses are so weak. But also to actually fight the Russians directly, to actually do that would require an industrial base that Britain doesn't possess. Everything that the British ruling class have done, probably since World War II, and actually a lot earlier, but certainly in the escalating deindustrialization that has gone on, has stripped the ability from British industry to actually provide weapons for an army. British politicians like Boris or Keir Starmer, there's no real difference between the two in terms of their delusions. They are equally gripped with this fevered imaginings that if they conjure up the idea of we'll conscript people, okay, how are you going to arm them? What's this, what are these Christian soldiers going to march to war with, Boris? You can't even produce enough ammunition for them. You can't produce enough uniforms for them. You can't produce enough transportation for them. Your ships don't work. Your navy is barely in existence anymore. Your air force will, according to the commander's own estimates, will be wiped out by the Russians inside a week. So where is all this production going to come from? They're given that modern warfare basically is a battle of, when it comes down to it, industrial capacity. We don't have any. It's all gone. And has been revealed by the fact that the Chinese are now the premier scientific and technological power on the planet. Arguably, the US has still got some role to play there as well, but certainly the Russians are making up for lost time now as well. What's been revealed is if you don't have an industrial base, you don't have a scientific base either. That goes as well. So they've got nothing other than sabotage, terrorism, and bullshitting. That's it.
Yes, eloquently put, my friend. And I think that I mean, I think this proxy war has very much exposed that disconnect. And it is quite clear that London and Washington and other neo-imperial powers have been living in this world of delusion. Like, they think that they can. I mean, if you actually, I mentioned on the last show that the Biden administration has, in a casual, low-key way, been amongst the most hawkish of any in recent memory. They have openly sought to foment and prolong proxy conflicts the world over, have gone far further than previous US administrations in order to do this. Keir Starmer himself seems very, very, very keen to embroil Britain in openly in all manner of conflicts. And it was recently reported that British soldiers are willing to die to defend Israel, and on top of all of his tub thumping jingoistic rhetoric on Ukraine. And it's like, but how are you going to do this? And as you say, all they can offer is cloak and dagger, black bag work, and a load of bullshit. I reported for my website there was a very interesting RAND report, which kind of fell by the wayside, but had all manner of stunning takeouts about how the US military is overstretched. It doesn't have the ammunition or the weapons or the vehicles to fight a major conflict. But not only that, yes, as you say, it lacks the defense industrial base. It's been hollowed out due to outsourcing and neglect over so long that they don't have the skills, let alone the technological capabilities and the resources to replenish the insane amount of ammunition they are sending to Ukraine. And this RAND report effectively called for reindustrialization of the US via fiat, which is to say, just print a ton more money at a time that so much money is being printed. It's creating runaway inflation, which is causing Pentagon contractors to step away from deals with the Pentagon because they're losing money. And the Pentagon's only response is to print more money to compensate them for their losses. To truly get up to speed in terms of being able to fight an actual war, as we are seeing in Ukraine and could potentially see in the South China Sea over Taiwan, that's going to necessitate a mass societal shift. It's going to have all sorts of implications for how America's economy is structured and how it operates. And this is just not considered. Their only remedy, if you can even call it that, is just print more money and spend it on things in the hope that this will make things better. It's quite remarkable, and the sheer lack of concern for blowback from doing this. I mean, irrespective of what one thinks of the what kind of countries and governments and societies and cultures Russia and China are. Britain would not be happy about Russia trying to create a Gladio-style terror army in Britain. And it's just like, well, I mean, when this stuff gets exposed, without any consideration of, when this stuff gets exposed, what are the consequences? What's this going to lead to? Oh, well, we don't need to worry because, you know, we're surrounded by oceans and we haven't been invaded since 1066, so we're okay. No, there will be consequences, and the reality will often set in very, very, very quickly here. And I might add as well that the leaked documents that we reported on at the Grey Zone related to this Gladio-style terror army, they were full of delusion, but they were also, it's quite clear that there remains a degree of reality-based analysis in the corridors of power, where there are this British intelligence cell, secret cell called Project Alchemy, which was put together by Charles Stickland, who is Charlie Stickland, who is the Lieutenant General and the head of Britain's permanent joint headquarters. You know, they were hatching all of these completely insane plans, while also recognizing that sanctions on Russia were A, going to damage the UK economically, B, spell the end of SWIFT, which is to say the US dominated payment system. So there is some kind of awareness of consequences, but in terms of dealing with them and facing the realities that that those consequences impose on Western powers, it's just not there. Like the thinking and the idea that, well, that these conflicts are in faraway lands, squabbles between peoples of which we know nothing. No, this could come home like pretty sharpish, and it already is to a large extent, to say nothing of what happens when Ukraine is almost inevitably abandoned by its Western sponsors, and then you have the problem of tens of thousands of bitter, battle-hardened British and American trained soldiers who have ready access to weapons and are extremely angry about being quote unquote stabbed in the back.
Well, yeah. Well, at that point they'll probably try and recruit them for some sort of foreign legion type shit. I would imagine, or alternatively recruit them to an internal security force to be used for domestic repression purposes, because they'll have less qualms about opening fire on populations that they don't feel they're a part of. Perhaps that's what the British have done before. When you end up with a security force you no longer need somewhere, take it somewhere else, plant them there, and make them your essentially Praetorian Guard, because they're dependent entirely upon the ruling class for continued existence, and it will have no qualms pulling the trigger for them. Either that, or it'll all blow up in their faces. Who knows? I hope for the latter rather than the former.
Yeah, and it's also as well is that, like, I mean, I think that the level of proxy involvement. I mean, it long before Britain got under Starmer started aggressively pushing for long-range strikes inside Russia, amongst other escalatory belligerent actions. It was very, very, very clear that the British and the Americans were heavily involved in the planning and execution of all manner of Ukrainian military operations, including the much vaunted and embarrassingly failed counteroffensive from last year, which we were told was going to rewrite military history and resulted in about 100,000 people being killed for literally nothing. Recently, Pravda, the Ukrainian Pravda, they published a very interesting investigation into Krinky, which is to say, Krinky was this beachhead that the Ukrainians sought to create in Kherson, and the wave after wave of foreign-trained Ukrainian soldiers were dropped one way or another on this beachhead in Krinky, and then were just consistently wiped out. The planning for the effort was abysmally bad, and much like the counteroffensive was based on the assumption that the Russians would just run away, therefore allowing equipment to be dropped or sent into where the Ukrainians were without resistance, and this didn't happen. Now, Pravda recently revealed that this was a British operation, Krinky, and that the Ukrainian fighters who were being sent were trained by Britain, they were being directed by Britain and armed by them. And I mean, this is like one of the most embarrassing military failures in history. I mean, it achieved nothing apart from getting an enormous number of people killed. And it strikes me as very, very clear from the leaks that we've reported on the Grey Zone, that Britain has all sorts of insane, far out, grand plans for military operations, and they are effectively just outsourcing that to other countries to do, with probably some degree of cognizance that, well, this is insane, but it's not us doing it. Therefore, let's see what let's see what happens and see if it can be successful. And it's like, again, I mean, on the stab in the back and the blowback point, I mean, if I was the relative or friend of someone who'd been sent to certain death in Krinky without air cover and without any of the most basic requirements for this insane operation to be a success, I would be extremely angry at the UK for putting them up to this.
Yeah, the point about both the Krinky operation and the Zaporozhye so-called counteroffensive, which was a disaster, which, I mean, anybody could have seen it was going to be a disaster, given how far in advance Zelensky telegraphed his intentions, basically announcing, if my memory serves correctly, at the end of 2022, that they were looking at Zaporozhye for the big offensive, announcing roughly when it was going to be, announcing like, this is the one, weeks and weeks in advance. They even did a cinematic trailer for it.
Yes.
And then lo and behold, what happened? Well, the whole thing fell to pieces, and 100,000 casualties later, oh well, that's over. But and also with the Krinky incident, both seem to have been dependent upon this idea that the Russian soldier would turn around and run away.
Yes.
Which I don't know where the fuck they've got this idea from, because it's not something which seems to me to be based in a real understanding of Russian or Soviet military history, given that it perhaps is based on like a very partial reading of the Yeltsin era Russian army in the first Chechen war. Perhaps there might be some element of validity to it then. But it would, even if you took that as like fact, that maybe they had huge morale problems and mass corruption caused the Russian army to fail dramatically in Chechnya in 94. Okay, we're almost 30 years on from that by the time the Russian special military operation comes around. Why the fuck are MI6 still basing their assumptions, if it is an assumption based on that, on one incident in a period of chaos from 28 years before the special military operation started? How bad are these people at their jobs that their whole plan depended upon a fantasy that the other side would just run away?
Yeah. No, this was as I kind of referenced that, like, this assumption was present in planning for the aforementioned counteroffensive. And the Wall Street Journal published an interesting, when it became very clear early on that the counteroffensive was just this complete nightmare, and the Russians had created these extensive defensive sites which were just lined with mines and dragon's teeth, as they are called, to prevent the Ukrainians getting very far. The Wall Street Journal reported that, well, the Americans knew that Kiev didn't have all the training and weapons it needed to dislodge Russian forces, but it was hoped that Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would win the day. Now, I mean, Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness versus tanks.
What is this sort of sub-Nietzschean shit that they're engaging in here? Like, have these guys just read Thus Spoke Zarathustra one too many times?
Yeah, well, this crops up in the leaked files that we reported on the Grey Zone. It stated that, well, one of the ways to keep Ukraine fighting at all costs and keep this going in this insane belief that this will result in regime change in Russia, and we can get our hands at last on Russia's enormous, incalculably vast resource wealth. It was stated, well, we need to conceal from the Ukrainians the dire battlefield reality for them. Right, but then it seems that the British and American planners and people within the CIA and MI6 and Pentagon, they actually believed all of the memes put about by NATO that the Russians were scared of the Leopard tanks, and they would just run away without factoring in, well, A, this is clearly an existential war from Russia's perspective, but B, the Soviets consistently fought to the last man in World War II, and it was remarked upon that by multiple Nazi officials that they don't surrender, they keep fighting and they keep fighting, and even it gets to the point where they have zero ammunition or means of defense, they're still trying to fight. And when we execute them, they are smiling and laughing because they know they're going to be avenged. That is the Russian mindset, and it endures to this day. But they are victims of their own hype and own delusions about Russian failure and embarrassment, which was the key propaganda focus at the very start of this, and this kind of almost like magical notion of Ukrainian invincibility and resourcefulness. I remember there were some reports, I think it was at the start of last year, about how the Ukrainians were nicknamed MacGyver in reference to the 1950s American detective show, that they were always finding unique and innovative ways to use weapons that caught the Russians by surprise. No, I mean, this is all fantasy. And we're seeing it unraveling in real time now. And I might add as well that, I mean, the such is their determination to prevent alternative perspectives entering the mainstream. This Project Alchemy cabal put together by Charlie Stickland, they were talking in February 2022 about the necessity of neutralizing independent media outlets such as the Grey Zone, because they understood what a threat to their desired narrative alternative media posed. And I think the fact that going after independent media like the Grey Zone was considered on a par with like sending Ukraine lots of weapons and providing them with training. It was as important to them silencing or discrediting alternative viewpoints, and there was no consideration to the fact that A, this could backfire, B, that when the entire media is claiming one thing based on what they're being told to write by people in power, there will be a significant proportion of the population who look to alternative media sources for dissenting perspectives. Again, no wider long-term strategy for dealing with that beyond censorship, beyond legal attacks and all sorts of things. And it's as if they're kind of aware that there will be consequences to their actions, but there is a sense of, well, it'll be all right on the night. We'll find one way or another. This won't actually, be a problem. So, the Gladio style operation that we exposed is just one of a great many strategies that Britain put together for just keeping this going. I'm pretty sure we'll subsequent to this announcement of Ukraine being greenlit to strike deep inside Russia, when that doesn't work out as hoped and intended, they'll try something else, which will again fail, and so on, rinse and repeat.
Well, I'd be very suspicious if I was in Poland right now of the British government's intentions towards me, my nation, because I saw it floats around in the British press every now and again how Poland is next on Putin's list, and also the clown, the rodeo clown Pete Hegseth, who Trump has nominated for Secretary of Defense, was saying that we know that they'll go to Poland next. That to me is projection, which is basically means that, well, we'd like Poland to get into this next. That's what they're really saying. That's why the British, under I think it was the disastrous reign of a certain Elizabeth Truss, signed that joint defence treaty with the Poles and Ukrainians. Because I'm thinking, well, what the hell kind of assistance is Britain going to provide to Poland, really? Other than, of course, trying to leverage them into being the next piece of meat into the grinder. But I don't think that the Polish population will go for it, because I think that the Polish governments, whether it is the more sort of petty nationalist variety or this sort of pro-EU variety are all pretty weak. Like, these aren't administrations that command a lot of loyalty. And they haven't, I mean, the restoration of capitalism in Poland hasn't brought a great deal of delight to the great bulk of the Polish population. So mobilizing for a war against Russia, or even some kind of provocation involving Belarus, to me doesn't seem like that would have a lot of takers outside of like the tiny numbers of the Polish elite. But certainly there are some in Britain who would want to push it in that direction. That, well, we'll just feed Poland into this grinder next.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the same in my neck of the woods in the Balkans, where this is something I've been writing about since the very start of the proxy war. It is very clear that Britain is stirring up tensions in order to try and foment a second front here, but people are having none of it. You know, I mean, you have leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina who are usually groomed and handpicked by Western powers, who give press conferences where they stand with Western officials and talk about how London and Washington and Brussels have no greater friend in Europe than the Bosnian security and intelligence services. But the public are having none of it. Yeah, and I've mentioned on the show before, and it bears repeating. You know, I was in Sarajevo a couple of years ago when there were British soldiers openly walking around in public in uniform with their guns. They were being booed, having abuse shouted at them. There were restaurants and bars that had signs in the window saying, "We don't serve soldiers." Like, it's again, what the Western powers, in particular Britain, don't seem to factor in is that populations don't want war, actually.
Not really.
And sorry, go. Yeah, and the as you mentioned, the government of Donald Tusk, which replaced PIS with much fanfare. I mean, yes, they're all in on keeping the proxy war going. They don't command public loyalty or support in any significant numbers at all. So, I mean, yes, if Poland is the next planned sphere of proxy war, I don't think it's going to last very long. No.
Well, let's then move into other perfidious Albion territory, shall we? Yes. With next item on the agenda for today, which is, of course, we were discussing over messages, the incident involving a certain Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia from a few years ago. I wanted to mention this because you've done reporting on this over a number of years now, and there's an inquiry into the sole admitted to death from this incident in Salisbury a few years ago, which is the Dawn Sturgis inquiry. If you're not familiar with who that is, she's a woman who was she and her sometime partner, a guy called Charles Rowley, were sort of the kind of, like many people in Britain, kind of living on the edge of poverty and homelessness. Apparently found a discarded bottle of something in a rubbish bin, sprayed it on themselves, and then Rowley became ill and Sturgis died. There was all kinds of this was after the Skripals were reportedly poisoned with Novichok, toxin so deadly that it didn't kill either of them. And the inquiry so far has been just an embarrassing farce, with many ludicrous claims being made. But one thing you posted about earlier this week, Kit, was the fact that Yulia Skripal, who is, again, with her father, Sergei, the Russian turncoat, has disappeared from public view following one brief video after being brought out of whatever coma she was in. Yulia Skripal, when she awoke, was claiming that in contradiction to the British official narrative, that she was sprayed with something at the ZZ restaurant they were at in Salisbury, rather than the Novichok being painted on the doorknob of their home, which of course caused the British state to officially become cat killers by eliminating the Skripal's very dangerous cat, it seemed. But I wanted to get your analysis of this and what we think might have actually gone on here, because this seems to be a series of farcical incidents that the British state has engaged in, specifically to carry out a frame-up job on the Russian government, pretending that the Russian government would be interested in eliminating a guy who was not even on their radar very much anymore. So What is your analysis of what went on then, and what is really going on with this inquiry into the death of the unfortunate Dawn Sturgis?
Right, sure. So, I mean, I think the death of Dawn Sturgis was a very strange chapter in the ever mystifying narrative of the alleged poisoning of Sergei Skripal, the GRU defector, and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury in March 2018. Yes, they were the Skripals were allegedly attacked with the most dangerous nerve agent on earth, where a single speck of it can kill you, and then who miraculously somehow didn't die. In July of that year, Dawn was taken ill at hospital and then subsequently died because, yes, as you mentioned, her partner, Charlie Rowley, found a perfume bottle in a charity collection, a regularly emptied charity collection bin, I might add, many months after the March Salisbury incident. And she is the only known person to have died from coming into contact with Novichok. Charlie Rowley sprayed this substance on his wrists, but after being in a coma for some weeks, is right as rain, although it doesn't appear that he will be testifying at this inquiry. There was a concerted effort by British authorities to stonewall, obfuscate, and delay a coroner's inquest into her death, and her family, who initially seemed to not believe the British state's claims about what happened, and openly stated in an interview with The Observer that they didn't blame Russia for her death. They were relentlessly pushing with legal assistance the British state to investigate her death. When a coroner's inquest was on the verge of being launched, the British state decided, oh, well, instead we'll have an inquiry. Now, they've done this before with the death of Litvinenko, Alexander Litvinenko, an FSB defector, in strange circumstances in 2006, because an inquest has powers of subpoena and people testify under oath. An inquiry is usually an establishment whitewash, and there are numerous examples of inquiries being used to fudge official investigations into mysterious deaths, such as David Kelly, the Iraq War WMD whistleblower, and also the 7/7 attacks. And funnily enough, several people who were involved in those whitewash cover-up inquiries are now involved in the Dawn Sturgis inquiry. But yet, nonetheless, yes, a small world. But yet, nonetheless, despite the best efforts of the British state to sabotage the inquiry, and the GCHQ, MI6, MI5 are all insulated from having to provide evidence, and the Skripals indicated that they wished to give evidence to the inquiry, and they've been prevented from doing so. But not only that, their police interviews from the time are not being entered into evidence, because apparently this would make them this would put them at risk of another Russian assassination attempt. Despite this, there have been some very interesting disclosures, to say the least. There is one, you have my tweet up on the screen. There was a correspondence with a doctor who was tending to the Skripals after they were admitted to hospital, who stated that within a few days, Yulia actually woke up and indicated that by nodding that she had been, quote unquote, sprayed in Zizi, which is this restaurant chain that the Skripals visited on the day they were allegedly poisoned. Now, number one, the fact that Yulia was suggesting that they were, quote unquote, sprayed in Zizi is a huge deviation from the ludicrous official narrative that they were poisoned via the doorknob of Sergei's MI6 bought Salisbury home, which two Russian assassins managed to smear Novichok all over, with nobody noticing them and no CCTV placing them anywhere near this front door. But even more significantly, the doctor in question testified that after he interviewed Yulia, albeit via nodding rather than her giving answers, he was warned not to discuss what she'd said, what she'd relayed to him, to anyone, and he was removed from the team looking after them. And then this seems rather neatly to tie in with the official narrative that it took weeks for the Skripals to wake up. Now, another kind of suspicious layer to this onion is that both the Skripals were tracheotomied, which is to say that their throats were being cut open to help them breathe. And this rather neatly synced up with when the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, were visiting Salisbury and sought to interview the Skripals, but they couldn't because they'd been tracheotomy, which is quite strange. I have an investigation forthcoming on this, that the Institute for Statecraft, which is this rather shadowy CIA and MI6, this rather shadowy MI6 and NATO front, they had been pushing for a number of years to diplomatically isolate Russia, and one of the means of doing that was a quote-unquote global Operation Foot. Now, Operation Foot was the expulsion in 1971 of over 100 Soviet officials from the UK under Ted Heath, and it was felt that by the Institute for Statecraft that this would serve to diplomatically isolate Russia. Following the Salisbury incident, London successfully corralled 26 countries into mass expulsions of Russian diplomats, which was openly referred to in the mainstream media as Operation Foot 2.0, which is in itself quite suspicious. But adding to this, the Institute for Statecraft was keeping a very close eye on how the Salisbury incident was being reported globally and what was being reported. And in one of their regular social media roundups, it was noted that the claim that the Skripals may never wake up is gaining good traction. And this is weeks after Yulia was very much awoken and saying things that were not particularly useful from the British state's perspectives. So it's quite clear that there was a wide-ranging cover-up of the Skripals not facing a life in coma or certain death from this, which included senior staff at the Salisbury Hospital to which they were admitted. It's all very, very puzzling. But I have recently written for my website about how I think that what we have heard so far points to something very, very different reality of what happened in Salisbury to what we've been told. And I think on the one hand, because this is now the best part of 7 years ago, very few people are paying attention, with some notable exceptions like John Helmer. Nobody's really keeping an eye on what is being said and recorded at this inquiry. But I might add as well that Dawn Sturgis, her death remains very mysterious because, yes, it was so long after the initial incident, and it was allegedly as a result of a bottle of Novichok disguised as perfume being found long after the alleged Russian assassins left Britain. Now, it has some independent journalists and researchers have made the point that, well, if this was the same Novichok that allegedly was used to poison the Skripals, the Russians must have had some kind of device for sealing perfume boxes with them. This is said with very much tongue in cheek, because it seems rather inconceivable that they would be possessed of such equipment. No, a British official has openly stated at the inquiry now that they must have had some kind of device like that with them, and it is the same bottle. My personal take on Sturgis's death, and this is just my surmise and conjecture, is that she was a blood sacrifice to maintain the narrative that Novichok was very, very lethal. Because after this initial wave of publicity about how, well, the whole of Salisbury, it could be at risk, and all of these well-publicized pictures of people in hazmat suits in Salisbury town centre, actually nobody was harmed at all, not even apparently initially some boys who were given bread by the Skripals after the Skripals were poisoned to feed ducks. One of the boys apparently ate some of this bread, but they weren't harmed. So it was and actually, this is rather forgotten, but if you look at polls from before Sturgis wound up dead, there was significant public skepticism about what the government was saying had happened. It was, from my perspective, therefore necessary for someone to die to silence the naysayers and keep this in the public imagination, because it had rather run out of steam as a story. So yeah, I'm keeping an eye on this. I have further investigations to come, but despite the fact that it is a whitewash show trial where people are effectively saying what the British state allows them to say, and it is there is a heavy shield of protection around how things come out. It's being live streamed, but with delay. So if MI5 and MI6 so choose, they can have things removed from the record, from transcripts, and so they'll never go. So it won't be broadcast. It's interesting how this was such a huge story at the time and was exploited for political purposes in order to demonize Russia, and then now the media is barely going near this. It does tend to suggest that the powers that be know that their story doesn't make sense, and they don't want people asking questions about it.
Well, it's consistent with all of the inquiries that you mentioned, going back over 20 years, that the actual reality is that these are largely cover-ups and rubber stamping exercises, where anything that could reveal the games being played by the intelligence services is walled off. Like, this was true of the inquiry into the Manchester bombing as well. There was a clear role played by the British state itself in the life of the man who was accused of being the Manchester bomber and his family. Again, that's not contested. The British state was heavily involved in their lives. The British state's collaboration with the group that they were members of was the reason they were in Manchester in the first place, the reason why they grew up here. And yet, like, that role, the exact role that the security services played in the life of this man, was never really explored. Or if it was in the inquiry, this was all sealed off. It was all classified. MI5, MI6 only gave evidence on the condition, basically, that none of it would ever be revealed. And it does lead you to think that the really powerful elements that make a lot of these key decisions that affect the lives of course, not just of people in Britain, but many millions of people potentially across the world. This is taken by a tiny handful of people in Britain. Like you're talking like a tiny handful of intelligence officials, senior bureaucrats, senior military men. Not even the politicians, I don't think, know half of this. Like, I think that for the likes of Theresa May or Keir Starmer's a willing servant of this system. But even he, I don't think, will know the details of what goes on with these operations, because this is like tiny circles making these decisions, like, the old school Thai brigade, the kind of people who've run the country for hundreds of years, basically. The politicians are just there to give the illusion that civilian control. Narrow clique of bankers, landowners, military and intelligence officials. The population is not permitted to know that most of the time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think that we mentioned Gladio. I think that one of the things that really sticks out to me is how when the Gladio scandal broke in the early 90s in Europe, and there were calls for public inquiries and investigations into the influence that Gladio cells had on domestic politics throughout the Cold War, within and without Europe. I mean, nothing really came of this, but there were official investigations, and over again, in the countries where there were probes, which is to say Switzerland, Belgium, and Italy, the British role, the fact that the British were running this, came up over and over again, and it's clear that the British knew far more about what these secret terror cells were doing than the governments of the countries involved. And this is the same with. I've got another investigation in the pipeline about MI6 collaboration with Stepan Bandera. And Bandera was being run by the Nazi-riddled CIA and MI6 created BND, which is to say Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service. But it is noted in openly available CIA files, Bonn, the capital of West Germany, is not kept in the loop on this because it's too sensitive for them to know. So it's like, and I think it does create the situation in which, people within the power structure have some vague idea that this is going on, but they know to leave it alone, because if they were to ask too many awkward questions publicly or try and poke their noses too obviously into the machinations of the secret state, there would be consequences for them. And I mean, it is a matter of public record that Pat Finucane, who was this Northern Irish human rights lawyer who was killed while having Sunday lunch with his family in the late 1980s. The British government has acknowledged that this was under David Cameron, that there was a degree of complicity and direction of the alleged Ulster paramilitaries that killed him with the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which is to say the British-controlled police force. And in private meetings with Finucane's family, David Cameron said, well, you got to understand that we can't get to the truth in this because there are people in buildings around here who won't let it happen. So, I mean, their civility and obsequy to MI5 and MI6 is hardwired into their thinking.
Well, and that's coming from a guy in David Cameron who is a literal member of the ruling class. Like that's,
yes.
You get people like Starmer, people like Gordon Brown, who were servants of the ruling class. That guy's from a ruling class family. So if he says that there's people around here who won't let it happen, he's speaking with knowledge because he probably went to school with them. But the point about Gladio, and I think this is a good place to perhaps draw our discussion today to a close on, because I have to get off in a few minutes. I wanted to just return to that for a moment, because I think this is a sort of a way into reconsidering post-World War II history. That and what you mentioned about the MI6 running Bandera's organization to essentially run a terrorist campaign in the Soviet Union for 7 years after the end of World War II. That's something that's not commonly known. But the entire construction of NATO and the post-World War II security apparatus by Britain and the United States, which Keir Starmer quite rightly says is part of the Labour Party's legacy. He's quite right about that. The construction of this and the what are described as Gladio type operations, because it's called Gladio because that was the only aspect of it that was publicly talked about. Because I think it's Julio Andreotti, the Italian Prime Minister, admitted to it. But as you say with your comment about the occupied 6 counties of Ireland, this is standard operating procedure for the British in most of the areas of the world they seek to maintain dominance in, which is underground terrorist organizations targeting various different people, pursuing constant strategies of tension, with the aim really not being about stopping a Soviet invasion, because my argument is there was never any serious Soviet plan to invade Western Europe, not under Stalin, certainly not under his successors, the revisionist successors, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, etc. This never existed. This was a propaganda fantasy. What NATO and the massive intelligence agencies that were reconstructed after World War II, with a lot of Nazi input as well, as you say, was really all about was keeping control of Western Europe. That was really what it was about. Not from the Soviets, but from the domestic populations, to squash the popularity of socialism and communism, to eliminate independent working class leadership, to make sure that potential sources of problems for the ruling class would be eliminated by either eliminating their leaders, disgracing them, or incorporating these into the machinery of the state, as has happened with the British trade union movement. And this is what NATO and the British and American underground operations in Europe after 45 are really about. It is maintenance of domestic control. It's nothing really to do with the illusory idea of some sort of Soviet invasion. But what is your opinion on that that interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think as well, again, based on my kind of local experience, following the end of the Cold War, there were several countries within the former Soviet sphere who were very eager to join NATO. I mean, that most obviously like Poland and the Chihuahua trio of the Baltic states. However, support for joining NATO is in many other parts of the Central and Eastern Europe was often not very high / majority opposed, and this in many cases involved getting governments enrolled in this entailed all manner of skullduggery, color revolutions, etc. What's really interesting to my mind is, I mean, in Macedonia and Montenegro, and I've written about this, there were CIA and MI6 plots all manner of skullduggery in order to get governments into NATO. The second that they were in, Western kind of interest in these countries plummeted. There is a sense of like, well, we've got them in now, so they are going to be our allies forever, and they're going to be effectively we've brought them to heel permanently. Again, there is a total lack of consideration about the fact that for blowback for this, particularly say in Montenegro, where at one point opposition to being part of NATO, and this is after the country joined, was 80%. It is a fundamentally unsustainable situation when, as imperial powers have consistently found out and continue to find out that, whether you personally want to militarily occupy and exploit and economically exploit the country is kind of immaterial when nobody wants you there. I think the prospects of countries crashing out of the NATO orbit actually is a very high one. But yeah, I mean, it is about it. NATO has always been about battering down domestic dissent, support for quote unquote radical politics and policies in order to keep governments behind, wedded to the Anglo-American neoliberal agenda. That's coming apart very rapidly now, and I think particularly in the Ukrainian context, we've mentioned this growing stab in the back narrative. That won't only lead to blowback in the form of neo-Nazi terror plots across Europe, of which several have already been busted. Almost invariably, the plotters have either fought in Ukraine or been tied to Azov regiment, the openly neo-Nazi military unit within the Ukrainian armed forces. But also, it's going to create public blowback in the form of mass opposition to joining NATO. Now, before the Maidan coup, and indeed in the years leading up to the start of Russia's so-called special military operation, there was never majority support in Ukraine for joining NATO. And I mean, yeah, you mentioned Chechnya. The Chechen wars were extremely brutal, but then you fast forward to today, and Chechens are among the most patriotic Russians that you could meet. On the whole, of course, there was a large number of Chechens who did go and fight alongside ISIS, but another CIA and MI6 created and managed a terror unit. But yeah, I think that actually a large number of people in Central and Eastern Europe are asking very serious questions about whether promises of Western military support and defense are worth the paper they're printed on, and whether they have been unnecessarily turned against their natural allies. Right. So, I mean, maintaining NATO hegemony in Central and Eastern Europe when an increasing number of people want out and are extremely angry about what they're getting dragged into, which includes anti-Russian sanctions, which Western powers knew were going to have a terrible boomerang effect on their domestic populations, but went ahead with anyway. And we're now seeing the deindustrialization of Europe and mass rising levels of unemployment and unsustainable levels of inflation. This has the prospect of pushing people into the Eastern camp. So I think, yeah, there is all to play for. We have discussed before how Romania occupies this rather interesting, as a regional example, occupies this very interesting space where they are historically brothers and sisters in arms with the Serbs. They have been dragged into NATO and the EU, and their political class is bought and paid for by the West and toe and Atlanticist line in all matters. But there is an increasingly large upswell of public opinion against NATO and in support of reclaiming Romanian territories given to Ukraine during and after World War II. And I think, as we've seen in Georgia recently, where the US and EU spent over 3 decades trying to create a perfect puppet in Georgia. The second the government stepped out of line, suddenly there's bullying and threats and sanctions. This has resulted in a massive denting of pro-EU, pro-US sentiment in Georgia. You know, after 3.5 decades of investing enormous amount of time and money and energy in turning the country against Russia. All it took was a public bust up with the legitimately elected government to start reversing that process.
Well, this is the fallout here is that is from the ultimate decline of the US and of course the British as well, which was what we were discussing earlier. As the emperor is revealed to be completely nude. The number of people who have been pretending to admire his fine raiment for many years will be declared liars by their own populations. I mean, in the end, you can't escape material reality, which is that for a lot of these countries, including Romania, like Romania, which was, when I was a kid, was portrayed to us as having the worst communist system, etc., etc. And then you look at what has happened to the working class in Romania since the fall of Ceausescu and the embrace of capitalism, and what's been done there is horrific. Like in terms of the actual reality of capitalism in these countries, they lost all of their industries. They lost all of the development that had gone on under the socialist period. A tiny Western-oriented elite looted everything and put themselves in charge. And so there's going to be a response to that. The snapback is coming. It generally takes a generation for these things to play out. And now we're here. We're 30 years after the end of the so-called Cold War. The response is here. This is the end of this period in time. And there's no better place to watch it than this channel. By
Absolutely.
the way. Absolutely. So this is why we will be weekly for you, dear audience, in the future. Bringing it to a close for today, but we will be back again next week. Kit, do you want to plug anything before we log off for today?
No, just support Decline and Fall in show form. I don't need in concept. We need to be optimistic. but yeah, no, it's been awesome. Again, I'm sorry about last week. It won't happen again. We're committed to doing this weekly, and I think there's never been a better time to be taking an intensive look at the collapse of the empire, because we are spectating it in real time now, as much as media and Western officials would like to pretend otherwise.
Yes. Do not believe MSNBC. Turn off your cable news. So, Kit Clarenberg, thank you for joining me again for another episode of Decline and Fall. Be sure to check out Kit's Substack, where his writing is based, and also your writing on the Grey Zone as well. Until next week, everybody, thank you for tuning in, and we'll be seeing you again very soon.
God bless you guys. Bye-bye. Take care.
All right, everybody, that's it for today. See you again tomorrow, and meanwhile, enjoy yourself with some music.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ Amada